In October 1955, a train pulled into a transit camp in Lower Saxony, and a crowd of women pressed against the fence holding photographs above their heads. The photographs showed young men in uniform taken more than a decade earlier. The men getting off the train were in their 40s, grey, and in many cases unrecognizable. Some families had come every time a transport was announced, for years, and gone home again. The Second World War in Europe ended in May 1945. The last German prisoners came home from the Soviet Union in January 1956. That is 11 years, and for the men on those final trains, it was longer than the war itself had lasted. Nobody has ever agreed on how many Germans went into Soviet captivity. German researchers put the figure at around 3 million. Soviet records registered a lower number, closer to 2.5 million, and the gap between those two figures is itself part of the story. Because a man who died in the first weeks before he reached a camp and was written into a ledger was never registered as a prisoner at all. The single most famous group was taken at Stalingrad. When the Sixth Army surrendered at the end of January and the beginning of February 1943, roughly 90,000 men marched out of the ruins into captivity. They were already starving, frostbitten and sick before they took a single step. Of those 90,000, something in the region of 6,000 ever saw Germany again. Most of the rest died within the first year, on the march to the camps or in the first winter. That was the pattern everywhere in the early years. Prisoners were moved enormous distances in unheated freight cars, held in camps that had not been built yet, and fed on rations calculated for men who were not working while being required to work. Mortality in 1943 and the first half of 1944 was catastrophic. The Soviet administration that held them was not the Gulag, though it worked in similar ways. It was a separate directorate for prisoners of war and internees, running hundreds of camp complexes and thousands of individual labor points spread from the Baltic to the Pacific. The prisoners were an economic resource, and the Soviet Union had just lost tens of millions of people and had entire cities reduced to foundations. So the men were put to work rebuilding what their own army had destroyed. German prisoners cleared rubble in Minsk and Kiev, worked the coal seams of the Donbass, cut timber in the far north, dug canals, laid rail, and built apartment blocks that people still live in. In Moscow, German prisoners worked on the construction of the great university tower on the Lenin Hills. Some of the men who had come east in 1941 in the trucks of an invading army spent the following decade putting the country back together by hand. Out of that captivity came something the Soviets had not initially planned and later found extremely useful, which was a German opposition movement made entirely of prisoners. In the summer of 1943, after Stalingrad, a National Committee for a Free Germany was founded in a camp outside Moscow, made up of captured officers and exiled German communists. Alongside it came a league of German officers, and the men who agreed to lead it were not junior. The commander who had surrendered at Stalingrad eventually joined the appeals to the German army to turn against Hitler. So did a general from the same encirclement who became the most prominent military face of the movement, broadcasting to German troops and signing leaflets dropped over the front. Their motives were argued about at the time and are argued about still. Some were genuinely convinced that the war was lost and that every further month cost lives for nothing. Some were trying to save themselves. Most were probably doing both, which is the ordinary condition of people in captivity. What is not in doubt is how the Soviet Union repaid them. The general who had led the Officers' League was sentenced to 25 years in 1950 and spent the following years in Soviet prisons, having been declared a traitor by the country he had broadcast against and treated as a criminal by the country he had broadcast for. He was released in 1955 with the last of the prisoners and returned to a West Germany that had no idea what to do with him. Conditions improved after 1945, in the sense that fewer men died. Rations were tied to work performance, camps organized their own theater groups and orchestras, and political education classes were run by the Soviets in the hope of sending home a generation of German communists. A number of prisoners genuinely were converted. Most simply attended because attendance was noted. Then, at the end of the 1940s, the repatriations began in earnest, and Germany started to believe the ordeal was ending. Hundreds of thousands came home across 1947, 48, and 49. In the spring of 1950, the Soviet news agency announced that the repatriation of German prisoners of war was complete. The announcement carried a qualification. A number of men, somewhere in the region of 13,000, were not prisoners of war any longer. They had been convicted or were awaiting trial as war criminals. Some of those men were exactly that: members of police and security units, men who had carried out reprisals and shootings, officers who had signed orders in the occupied territories. Others were ordinary soldiers processed through mass proceedings in 1949 and 1950 that lasted minutes and delivered near-identical sentences of 25 years hard labor. There was no meaningful defense and no appeal. For the families at home, the distinction did not matter much. Their announcement had said the prisoners were home, and their man was not. For those families, the next 5 years were the worst part. The war had been over for half a decade. West Germany had a currency, a government, and the beginnings of an economic recovery. And several thousand households were still writing to the Red Cross Search Service about a man last seen in 1943, not knowing whether they were waiting for someone or mourning him. The thing that finally moved was politics. In September 1955, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer flew to Moscow. It was the first visit by a West German head of government to the Soviet Union, and the official purpose was the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two states. Adenauer had a second purpose, and he made it a condition. He would not sign anything unless the remaining prisoners came home. The negotiation was tense and nearly collapsed. The Soviet side insisted the men in question were convicted criminals, not prisoners of war, and that their release was an internal legal matter. Adenauer held the line, and by the end of the visit, an understanding had been reached that was never fully written into the formal agreement. Relations would be established. The men would be released. They came home over the following months through the transit camp at Friedland near Göttingen in transports that ran from October 1955 into January 1956. Somewhere around 9,500 prisoners of war returned, together with roughly 20,000 German civilians who had been deported and interned, many of them women taken from East Prussia and Silesia in 1945 as forced labor. The German press called them the late returnees. The newsreel footage of those arrivals is some of the most watched material of the entire post-war period in Germany. Men in shapeless coats stepping down onto a platform. The camp bell ringing, lists of names read out, boards covered in photographs, with women asking every arriving man whether he had ever seen this face in any camp, anywhere, at any time. Then came the part the newsreels did not follow. A man who had disappeared in 1943 came back to a wife who had been legally declared a widow and had remarried, and to children who had grown up entirely without him and who did not recognize the stranger in the hallway. He came back to a country he did not understand, with a currency he had never used, into an economy that had no place prepared for a 45-year-old with no trade and 11 years missing from his working life. There was compensation legislation, and there was a small payment for each year of captivity, and there was very little else. The psychological damage was not treated because it was not, at that point, something anyone in Germany was prepared to name. Those returning to East Germany faced something different again. They were received separately, and they were expected to be discreet about what Soviet captivity had actually been like. A returnee who talked openly about the first winters was a political problem in a state whose founding story was friendship with the Soviet Union. The returnees also became politically useful very quickly, which did them no favors. In West Germany, the homecoming of 1955 was presented as a national triumph and as a personal achievement of the Chancellor, and it was used hard in the election campaign that followed. The men themselves became a symbol of German suffering, which fitted comfortably into a public mood that preferred to think of Germans as the war's victims rather than its authors. Veterans' associations grew powerful on that sentiment. What got lost in it was the individual, who was not a symbol of anything, and who was mostly trying to find work and sleep through the night. And there were the men who never came at all. The Soviet Union did not open its prisoner records to German researchers until the 1990s, half a century after the events. Only then could many families finally establish where and when their father or brother had died, and be told the name of a camp cemetery in a place they had never heard of. For thousands of others, the answer never arrived and never will. The arithmetic is the hardest part of this story. Roughly 3 million men taken. The German commission that studied it after the war estimated that more than 1 million never returned. Soviet records account for a far lower figure, somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 deaths, and the true number sits somewhere in that gap and will probably never be settled. Of the 90,000 men who walked out of Stalingrad, 6,000 came home. And of the entire body of German prisoners taken in the East, the last of them stepped off a train onto a German platform 11 years after the shooting stopped, into a country that had already finished rebuilding itself without them. Thanks for watching. If you want to know about the German soldier who stayed hidden for 4 decades rather than surrender, watch that story next. And if you want more forgotten aftermath stories from the Second World War, subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.